Okay.
Cool.
Hi, everybody. We're going to do a Q&A today, straight up Q&A, because we had a lot of questions left over from last week. So David, unless you've got anything you want to jump into, we'll just jump into the questions.
Let's go right into it. Sounds good.
Okay. First one, I'm regularly feeling low and depressed, and I'm struggling to get my wife's spirit to lift and see her smile again. Most of the time she's crying and depressed from my betrayal. How long will it take to see her recover?
Wow. There's so many factors that go into that, of course. Both the personal history of, betrayed partners can oftentimes there's a history of abandonment or betrayal in the past or abuse. And there's other kinds of stuff that factor into it besides the addiction itself and their current life. So I think, when we talk about the overall trajectory of recovery for couples, basically, according to Stephanie Carnes, is a model as long as 5 years, which looks at a very long time, obviously, it sounds like, but that's 5 years of really rebuilding and moving far past where the marriage was originally, right? This is healing and developing much deeper senses of intimacy and depth and communication and just awareness of each other. So it's really moving the relationship past where it was and out of that hole that you're kind of talking about right now into not just back to where it was, but far beyond. And so now to more specifically your question, it sadly say it depends. I think I wouldn't expect really a lot of mood changes, and people can start hopefully not be crying all the time or be raging all the time or be angry or hurt, but start to really be able to regulate their moods in a much better way. I would say by the time a year has passed, and oftentimes much sooner than that, people have a much people are kind of over the wild emotional swings. They're starting to deal with stuff, and they're getting tools. Most importantly, they're getting tools to deal with some of these things. And so I think the things you can do to encourage that and speed that up is making sure your partner has adequate support resources. And by that, I mean both a professional resource like a CSAP therapist, a support group of people, of other women or partners. Seeking Integrity has a whole bunch of things online that are free resources for partner support. And we know, just like with the addict, where connection and support is everything, the same thing goes with the betrayed partner. And one of the frustrations, I think, of an addict who's really turned the corner and is starting to really work on compassion and empathy, and I hear it in your question, is like, what can I do to make it better? And the sad part in the beginning, at least, is probably the addict probably can't do very much except work their program, follow through with their actions, be pristine with your word and your integrity, and just do stuff by the book and over again. And that's that time, that repetition of good behavior that is finally going to start to, I think, help people turn the corner. The other thing I'll just say is that more often than not, and this sounds kind of counterintuitive sometimes to the addict, but what I hear partners saying is that it's not so much the actions as the lies about the actions, the dishonesty, the gaslighting, and that can continue sometimes into recovery. There's nothing more devastating and damaging than those kind of continuation of lies and mistruths. And so I'd really encourage you to just talk about what your process is. If you've struggled, we sort of teach our guys at Seek Integrity, if there's a struggle, if there's a slip or a relapse or a near miss, process it with your therapist, process it with your support group, but then process it with your spouse. Tell her or him what has happened to you and what you're doing about it. And I think it's that kind of transparency. I don't think most people expect anybody to do anything perfectly, but if we're not doing it perfectly, the expectation is that we'll be honest about that and talk about it and what we can do better next time. And so I think there's a lot we can do, but in the beginning, at least, we kind of have to keep our side of the street clear and make sure your partner has support. And then the recovery has to happen over there without so much interference, I think, on the part of the addict.
Yeah, I mean, the difficult part of this is that as recovering addicts, we're on an emotional roller coaster for that first year, really, as we learn how to cope with emotions we've been avoiding for so long. And at the same time, our betrayed partner is on an emotional roller coaster. According to Dr. Rob, it's about a year. If you do everything right, then it will will kind of calm down. And the bad part of this is it's not the same roller coaster. You'll be up and she'll be down, and you'll be down and she'll be up. And, once in a while you'll be up together, and once in a while you'll be down together. That's no fun. But yeah, and as David said, there's not much you can do except keep your side of the street clean and take accountability for what you've done. Yes, I know I hurt you. I did this. I'm sorry. Here are the things I'm doing to not behave that way again. And early on, that's all you can do. She probably is too mad at you to be comforted by you in the first few months of recovery.
Yeah, and yeah, that's true. I wanted to respond also, Scott, about to the beginning part of this person describing their own kind of low moods, right? And depression, and that's not unusual either in early recovery from sex, porn, or chemsex addiction. All these intensity addictions that build up tremendous amounts of dopamine and adrenaline, and our bodies and our brains get used to all that intensity. And when we get into recovery, the intensity stops, but our brain has already adapted physically to all the intensity. And so there's a period of time, there's like a catch-up period where the brain readjusts back to normal. But in that space, we can be depressed, we can be what's called anhedonic, where everything's kind of blah and uninteresting, and food doesn't taste good, and colors aren't as bright, and life seems kind of hopeless. A lot of people mistake that for recovery, and that's a temporary phase while our brains are healing, basically.
Yeah. I love this next question. This is from a betrayed partner who's doing what betrayed partners do, which is research the addiction and the betrayal and the trauma. And this individual wants to know how much research is too much? When does it become obsessive? When do I need to step away? If I don't step away, can this create a whole new set of problems and circumstances?
Boy, great question. And Scott's so right. The common strategy, if not the primary strategy of betrayed partners, when they're trying to find their footing again, right after the rug's pulled out from under them, and their whole life as they thought they knew it is not, and it's very disorienting. And so one of the strategies partners do for emotional safety is try to research. Okay, if I can find more about what exactly has happened, what's gone on, why is this the case? How long has it been going on? With whom? And all those questions that they think once they know that, they'll be the mistaken part about this strategy is that, well, then I'll feel better, right? The problem is, and I know this from countless partners I've worked with, that there's never enough information to really make you feel better. The more you dig, the more questions you have, and it's really a bottomless pit of unending things to look into and research. And believe me, partners become excellent researchers, amazingly so. But and it's an attempt to establish emotional safety, but it doesn't work. And so there's even a name for it, I think, pain shopping or things like that, where people will go and partners will kind of start to research again. And it's almost, they know it's going to cause them a lot of emotional pain and upset, but they almost can't help themselves. We've had clients, wives and partners who would read, the addict might have shared texts from an affair partner, say, with them as a way of trying to disclose and come clean, and the partner will read those texts over and over again, causing tremendous pain, but they can't put them down. That kind of stuff is really, I think, self-destructive, and I think at some point soon a partner has to put that down. I think when we're doing this kind of research, a little research is okay. I think if you're going to do some research, maybe look into sex addiction and porn addiction, what that's all about. But to try to, look at cell phone records and cross-index calls and all that stuff, it's just going to cause you more grief, in my opinion. Partners have a right to know, right? That's the whole idea of a formal disclosure. And the formal disclosure is just that. It's formal. There's a process, and it takes time, and there's adequate support on both sides. Both the addict and the partner have their people in their corner that are helping, and it's, when it's done properly, it can provide that kind of resolution that you're talking about. But in the meantime, I think I'd really put down the research tools and talk about it, get support for yourself, talk to other partners who've gone through this and see what their experience has been and how they were able to break free, almost an obsession of research, right? Because it really just, it ends up nothing but really being more painful in my experience.
Yeah. We have a work group, an online work group for betrayed partners. And I know they address this in there. So you may want to look into that. You can find that on seekingintegrity.com. Just click on the work groups tab and scroll down to betrayed partners. Yeah, get help for yourself. I would recommend you've got to have your own therapist, preferably a CSAT who understands what you're going through. If you want help finding one, we will email us. We'll help you find one in your area. Pain shopping. Betrayed partners often pain shop to their detriment, and you don't have to do it. And if you want to know more about disclosure, there's an excellent book. We already mentioned Steph Carnes today. We're going to mention her again. She wrote a book called Courageous Love. It is absolutely a soup to nuts look at the disclosure process, what you should expect, how you should proceed. It is terrific. It's called Courageous Love. So, because you do have a right to know, you do have a right to understand what sex addiction is, and you're coming here, we'll explain it. But if you have your own CSAT, I think that'll really help too. A CSAT can look at you and say, too much. Great question. Next one here. My husband started recovery a year and a half, I think after a year and a half after realizing he was a sex addict, or a year and a half ago after realizing he was a sex addict, and this was after 20 years of acting out. He went through 2 courses, started building strong connections within a support group, and has been in therapy with a non-CSAT therapist. Things were going well until about 2 weeks ago when I discovered text messages and emails between him and a female coworker. Is it possible for him to beat this addiction, or should I expect these slips if I stay?
Great question. And I think, we see these kind of, I guess, infiltrations of bad behavior into different recovery. I think, do people live without doing that? Absolutely. And so I think you don't have to necessarily build in that expectation that this is just something you're going to have to learn to live with. I think these are things that far into recovery. Hopefully you guys are doing daily check-ins and communication, that kind of stuff, where you can talk about some of these things. You can talk about your disappointment and your hurt or betrayal that was reawakened or whatever, and he can maybe talk about what's going on there. I think though that from what you said, I guess my concern would be, yes, good to take some work groups. It's good to have a therapist. It's better to have a CSAT therapist, and it may be even better yet to get into some kind of treatment, even an outpatient something or other, but it's some kind of structured treatment, because the level of intervention that he's putting into his recovery may not be enough to keep some of these things from creeping in. In the best of circumstances, they can creep in, but I think what happens if they don't build up in such a destructive way. So, and then there's ways to remedy this, right? People have to work. People work with females, but there's ways to do it. You can limit such text exchanges. If you're meeting, you meet in an open door. If you never travel, together or alone, or there's rules like that make these things manageable, so that people don't have to quit their jobs or totally interrupt their lives. But it also, you have a right to feel that we were just talking a moment ago about emotional safety, and that's what this is about. And I imagine finding those text things have been very upsetting for you, and there's no really excuse for that, and especially if it's kind of sneakily done. So I would really, if you guys have a therapist that you feel comfortable meeting with, it might be that you can have a conversation about this and what just happened and what you discovered 2 weeks ago in the context of a therapy session with somebody, his or hers or a couples therapist, because I think there's some issues here that probably need to be clarified. And I don't know. I was trying to read between your lines and see if that's something the addict might have told you, well, this is going to happen. No, I wouldn't set up that expectation, right? Do people have struggles? Yeah. But this is not something you have to like learn to accept, if that's the implication there. Absolutely not. You know, I think, and I think I would just kick it up a notch and get a little bit higher level of intervention here from a therapist, or at least a session or two talking about what just happened, because this is a pattern you want to interrupt now.
Yeah. In the work groups, I work with the addicts, and I tell them slips are not uncommon, but they're not mandatory, and they're always incredibly harmful. They're less harmful if you come clean on your own than if your wife discovers, or your partner discovers, which is what happened here. I discovered text messages and emails. It's the lies and secrets that ultimately do the most damage. So, and as David said, when there are slips, we tend to escalate the level of intervention all the way up to and including residential treatment. But yeah, I would definitely at least escalate to a CSAT rather than a non-CSAT. So yeah, okay. My porn addict has had a lot of depression for years, to the point of saying he's suicidal. I don't know where the addiction stops and where the depression starts. They seem to be so mixed. Now that we are separated, I'm scared he will hurt himself. Does the addiction make people suicidal or depressed, or is that separated from the addiction? Another great question.
Beautiful question. And, you know, the answer there is complicated, because we know that depression is a risk factor for becoming an addict. We know that addiction frequently causes major depressive disorder. So you kind of have it coming and going both ways. And so it's really hard to say. I think when you say he's been depressed for years, this makes me think this is a more chronic, ingrained pattern with a mood disorder there. Sometimes people act out as a way to self-medicate. Sometimes it's the consequence, that depression, or the consequence of the addictive behavior. I think what really has to happen is get a really good therapist or even a psychiatrist to do a consultation and see if you can do what's called a differential diagnosis, where we kind of, as a therapist, I would go and look at different causes of depression, causes of addictive behavior, and how they interface in the particular history of your husband, because those patterns are really telling. There is a huge overlay with major depressive disorder and sex addiction and porn addiction, to the point of like 20–25% of sex addicts also meet the criteria for major depressive disorder. When you have that long-term pattern, it's even more extreme. And I would say, and it's not, I wouldn't say to discard your concern, because for a lot of addicts, if not every addict, our addictive disorders are our primary coping mechanisms to deal with stuff. And if we take away the addiction without really building a whole new system of coping skills, we're at risk. And I have seen people get quite suicidally depressed, and seriously so. So I think, and this is again where a professional can help evaluate this, you know, because you look at things like lethality or intention. Has people just done a lot of verbal, I'm going to do it, or have they actually gone out and tried it? Have they have a plan? If they had a plan, how serious was that plan? You know, guns, for example, or that gets everybody's attention because those are really serious and permanent. Whereas, you know, pills, maybe not so much, although I don't discount them either. So there's a lot of factors here that I think need some professional opinion. And the good news is that if this major depression, or if it is indeed a thing that's separate from the addiction, there's plenty of great treatments out there, both therapeutic treatment in terms of talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and medication. And I'll say, we've said here before, but literature shows the best results come from not one or the other, but both. That combination of talk therapy and medication is very effective. And it could be, again, this is where you want a professional to help out. If there's trauma, if there's abuse, if there's other issues there, grief, abandonment, I mean, there's all kinds of other issues that can be addressed with therapy that can also lessen the severity of it. But it scares me to hear about somebody who's bringing up the suicide word. I take it very, very seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this next question too. How long will it take for the addict to learn to feel empathy? And I love how that's worded. How long will it take for the addict to learn to feel empathy, which is how it works. We have to learn to feel empathy, most of us anyway. David.
Right. Again, these are great questions. So my feeling is that most addicts, unless we're well into the antisocial sociopath kind of category, and that's very rare for at least people we see at Seek Integrity, every addict, especially sex and porn addicts, develop these very narcissistic tendencies where they get literally cut off from kind of the feelings. In my experience, the hardware is still there. We still have mirror neurons. We still have what's called an empathy circuit in our head, dedicated wiring in our heads meant to learn empathy and compassion for people. It's just addiction disconnects those things, as does trauma and a bunch of other things too. So I think the task here is to learn how to reconnect, and oftentimes learn for the first time, as Scott was just saying, the first time on how to express it and convey it. And for that, I really like DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a whole therapy model based on skill sets. And one of those skills is learning empathy and compassion. And what's great about DBT, and I think it's counterintuitive to a lot of people, but the idea is that we learn the skill first, and then we learn the feeling later. And so this is the approach I take with my clients, where, okay, as a universal rule of thumb, every sex and porn addict needs to work on compassion and empathy. The thing is, we can learn those compassion empathy skills, and we call them from the inside, not from the inside out, where my heart tells me I should do this and I'm driven to do it, but I learn the skill from the outside in, right? I learn how to do it. I learn the mechanics of it. And DBT has things like, literally charts like, okay, here's a situation I want and you want, and how do I negotiate those two things? Or there's things like learning cognitive empathy, right? And knowing, gee, in my head, I can see how that would cause you pain. I can understand understand a thinking word would cause you pain, but it's not really coming from a feeling space yet, right? So we want to move from that cognitive empathy. I can see what I've done would cause you a lot of distress or whatever, down to, wow, I can really understand how you'd be feeling hurt and pain and abandoned and lonely, down to at a feeling level. And that's where we want to go. But it takes practice, and it takes practice learning those skills. And that's so to answer your question, that was really long. I got into the weeds on that one. Sorry. The skills can be done relatively quickly. Now, how effectively they're put into practice is another thing. But I look at really getting back some meaningful compassion and empathy. I'm putting that like 6 months to 12 months in recovery, if not sooner. I think those compassion and empathy skills can be started to be taught right away. Now, remember, the definition of empathy is feeling what somebody else is feeling. And also remember that most addicts are totally cut off from all their feelings. And so I can't relate to what you're feeling, whether it's pain, loneliness, abandonment, hurt, whatever, if I don't know how to feel that myself. And most addicts are so cut off from feelings, they have a hard time with that. And so the reason I said 6 to 12 months is because those first 6 months, the addict is really trying to figure out, what am I feeling? And we give our addicts, the feeling wheels and the emojis and all that to really help people start to figure out, what am I feeling? And that sounds so kind of ridiculous, but it really is a skill that's missing at first. So once the addict has a sense of their own, how feelings feel in their own body, they can start to understand how it must feel for somebody else. That's the connection there. So.
Yeah. And when David says 6 months to 12 months, that's if they're working on it.
Oh yeah.
Like when I got into recovery, I was single. I'm still single. So I really wasn't working on empathy. I was really focused on myself. But somewhere in the second half of year 2, empathy started to naturally occur. So even without working on it, it started to come just as I was becoming more and more a part of the world. With David's or somebody who knows how to teach this, and DBT is definitely the way to go. you can speed up, but unless the addict is working on it, it's not going to come around, or it's going to come around more slowly.
Right.
So yeah. Okay. My husband has been saying he's sober and that he hasn't had any slips, but I have found little things here and there, like inappropriate articles, YouTube videos that are definitely edging around inappropriate stuff. When I confronted him about the inappropriate article, he lied about it multiple times until he finally admitted that he lied. To me, that's not recovery, but he still says he is in recovery and sober. What do you do when you clearly have definition differences?
Great question. Yeah, so what we're starting to find, there's all kinds of ways to get that dopamine hit without technically, say, looking at porn, right? So you can look at Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, what we call not porn, right? Things that are titillating, but I guess wouldn't be classified as, you know, X-rated pornography. And this is a disaster zone for a lot of recovering addicts, because they think this is a safe place they can still indulge in the fantasy and the escape, and it keeps the recovery just basically locked down, frozen in place. And because the fantasy dynamic is still the same, it doesn't matter if it's hardcore pornography or you know, a bunch of nearly nude people on TikTok. It's TikTok. It's the same thing. And so I think to really take that into account is really important for people, and to get really clear. We've started to become very explicit with our own clients about not porn and what that means, and making sure it shows up in inner circles or the middle circle, just to make sure people understand the danger of that. So I think, I guess, is this what I'm hearing? This comes down to communication and honesty on the part of the addict. It may be that the addict isn't aware of some of those things. Like, he's certainly aware of what he's doing, but so nobody may have called him on it before. I think, again, this might be a place where your CSAT or therapist can really help intervene and define things and kind of lay down the law a little bit about what's okay and what's not okay, because we know that you know, if we look at porn, we know what happens in our brain, just dopamine wise. We know that if we think about stuff or look at things on TikTok, it's almost the same thing, right? Our brain is registering it as the same way. The brain is not making a difference. And so when we start to draw these little lines in the sand, well, this is okay and that's not, I think we're playing games, and boy, games and recovery don't mix. So I think the clarification, and again, I think just to avoid the two of you getting into a power struggle, which probably isn't very helpful, I would have a CSAT or a therapist or a sponsor or somebody that talks this language be the heavy in this, and really make clear what's okay and what's not okay, because that's not okay. And addicts, you know, as we've talked about here every week, probably, that, you know, addicts lie for a while, and it's like kind of automatic, and we're defensive. But again, a really big warning sign, and Scott and I have talked about this numerous times before, when people start getting defensive or blaming or lying or hiding, I mean, all those are really bad signs to me, because this is a program about humility and honesty and owning up when we have messed up, and that's where we want to go. But I think I think the best person to convey that would be somebody besides you, a therapist or a sponsor, somebody, because you're just going to get in a power struggle.
Yeah, I mean, as I read this question, I thought, man, this guy needs a circle plan in the worst way.
Yes.
And he needs to share it with you. A circle plan, and I put a link in the chat feature to our online work groups. We've got an online sex addiction work group starting November 12th. We've got one for porn addicts starting, I think, this Saturday, November 7th, whenever that is. We do circle plans in there, and we spend a lot of time on them. And I talk to guys about what we call not porn. It's technically not porn, but they're using it like it's porn, and they need to be aware of that. You know, the circle plan, we have a red circle, which is the inner circle. It's the bottom line problem behaviors. Then we have a yellow circle, which is slippery behaviors. And then we have a bigger green circle, which is healthy behaviors. You know, a lot of guys will put pornography in their red circle, but they don't want to put not porn in the red circle. And, you know, and we go round and round until they put it in the red circle, because, you know, I want them to understand that just because it's not porn doesn't mean they're not using it like porn, and doesn't mean it's not going to upset their partner. Because, you know, partners look at that and say, women in bikinis is women in bikinis, you know, it's porn. And they're right, you know, the betrayed partners are right. And then the lies and secrets, that's a tough one. I'm with David. It's not a sign of good recovery. And I just want to be clear, you can be in recovery and not sober, and then you can be sober but not in good recovery. So, or you can be in good recovery and sober, or you can be in neither. You know, he may still be in recovery, but I wouldn't call him sober if he's engaging in these behaviors. I don't know if you have thoughts on sobriety versus recovery, David.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I'm a recovering alcoholic. I came out of the substance world, and there was very little distinguishing of that, right? If I had a drink, I'd relapsed. And there's slightly more shades of gray, but I tend to be pretty clear cut on that. And I think, yeah, there's slips, there's little slip ups and mess ups. But I think when it starts to become a pattern, when it starts to become defended, when it starts to become a secret, you know, all that stuff, it starts to have an energy around it. That's not a good sign for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And the question I always ask the addicts is, if it's not a problem, why are you keeping it secret? Why are you lying about it when she asks you about it? Obviously, you know it's a problem. Maybe you should reset your sobriety clock. So yeah, and yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I was just saying that's a great exercise for every addict to do too, because if there's stuff that we're resistant about giving up or revealing to somebody that we do, I mean, that's a bad sign, right? Those are things that we're protecting and hiding, and so I think we see that a lot with sex addicts who also happen to use a lot of alcohol or drugs, and you know, they don't want to give up the alcohol or the drugs because that's not the problem. Sex is the problem. Well, when we get into addiction, it's so easy to just you know, whack-a-mole from one to the next and the next. And so we have to really be honest about not only the other addictive substances and behaviors, but things like this that are maybe shades of gray, if you will, along those lines.
Okay, next one here. I noticed my husband looking at my sister inappropriately, which kills me. He's seen me notice this, and he's become cold and angry with me. When I brought it up, that my family is my happy, safe place, but now I'm all hyper vigilant when my sister's around, and I feel that's unfair. He says he didn't mean to make my home an unsafe place for me, and what can he do to help? I told him not to look at my sister's body and to explore, you know, how and why he did that and how it affects me with his therapist. Is this behavior of his just normal and something I have to accept, or is this a problem?
I guess I go with your gut. What the meaning, the person that just wrote that question, what is your gut saying? It's a problem. It's a problem for you. It upset you a lot. And I can understand how that would be, right? Our homes have to be safe. We have to be safe with our partners in the world, wherever we are. And if we feel based on history, and sometimes people can get overly sensitive based on history, and kind of hypervigilant to any kind of sign of betrayal. This sounds though pretty blatant, and it's a pattern that causes you upset, and that's enough. Whether it's right or wrong in anybody else's eyes, that's a matter for concern, and I think he needs to adapt his behavior and talk about that. And I think your concern is totally legitimate in my point of view. You know, there's nothing more disturbing if you're trying to have a conversation with somebody and the person you're talking to, their eyes are wandering around the room, right? It's a disregard of you and other people. And so I think this is something to talk about. If you guys have, again, therapeutic help, if you do check-ins, there's a great sentence that we've used here before on the webinar. And basically it's a nice way of saying how you're feeling based on somebody else's behavior. It's like, when you do X, it makes me feel why, and then there's a third part of, and this is what I would like you to do or not do about that. But basically the core of that is, when you do that behavior, it makes me feel, hurt, lonely, abandoned, angry, whatever. And that's just a beautiful, simple way of conveying how somebody else's behavior directly impacts you and what it does. And there's really not much to argue about that, right? It's your feeling, you have a right to your feelings, and it's a nice way of opening a conversation about those kind of behaviors without necessarily at least immediately get into a power struggle or a fight. And hopefully it sounds like your husband's a little bit sympathetic at least to how you're feeling, and that's a good thing. But conversation and communication really is key to this, and his willingness to make changes in behavior. A lot of the couples therapy is not just an addiction world, but couples therapy strategies in almost any modality. There's something called a partner behavior change, and it may be a totally innocent thing, but if my partner is doing it and it's bothering me, I have a right to ask him or her not to do it, and hopefully to have that be respected. So this is clearly bothering you. Whether the objective world thinks it's right or wrong doesn't even matter. It's caused you upset, and therefore you have a right to ask for a change, in my opinion.
Yeah, and for the addicts out there, your filter, your ability to discern appropriate versus inappropriate is broken. It's broken. Don't use your judgment on this. All right. Take a little version of your partner, put him or her on your shoulder, and they see and hear everything you see and hear. And if they wouldn't like it, don't do it. I can't tell you how many, I don't sponsor anymore because it just conflicts with my work. But I used to have some sponsees, and we would go out to dinner, and I would catch them flirting with the waitress. I'd say, why are you flirting with the waitress? I'm not flirting with the waitress. I'm just being nice. Last week we had a waiter, and all you did was place your order. Well, I'm not flirting. I'm just being nice. Would your wife say you're flirting? Well, yeah, but she thinks I'm like, okay, stop. Your wife would say you're flirting. Just no.
Right. Right.
The filter of addicts, it's broken. And the first year or longer of recovery, we do not make very good decisions about when we're being appropriate and when we're not. We need someone to poke us and say, not cool. So yeah. Okay, next one. Love this question. Are men naturally polyamorous and capable of performing sex without emotional intimacy, while for women there has to be an emotional component?
Wow. Yeah, so there's a lot of research on this with mixed results, right? They've found in nature different species that are monogamous, different species that are not. And a lot of that has to do with culture and history, and in the human species, at least, morality and kind of external things imposed on that. So it's really hard to say what a human being would do without all that cultural stuff providing some guardrails on the behavior. I think it's probably generally accepted that men, especially, and addicts, almost universally, sex addicts at least, have the ability to have sex without intimacy, without emotional connection, without all that. It's a transactional interaction. That becomes sometimes the norm with sex addiction. And although people talk about seeking connection, that kind of transactional sex, I think, often leaves people feeling pretty empty and hollow, and just they may have a lot of sex, but it just doesn't. Once the dopamine kick is gone, it just kind of feels pretty yucky, I think, for a lot of people. But can it be done? Yeah, and I would say probably, although it's far less with women, I think probably we're having a lot of cultural assumptions and baggage weighing us down here too. I think women are probably perfectly capable of that under certain circumstances as well. Now, is that the ideal? And we're not the morality police, no judgment about, hookups. Hookups are great. But I think in the long run, from what I've seen most of the work I've done with people for 30 years have been just a whole lot of hookups, and they're not very happy people at the end. I think people are much happier if they can have a broader connection than just the dopamine and the adrenaline, but as we've talked about recently, bringing in the serotonin, the norepinephrine, and the oxytocin, and all those other beautiful neurochemicals that round out the experience and make it much more meaningful. So I think in the end it comes down to choice in terms of how people want to behave. There's a lot of interest right now in polyamory and other ways of organizing, and all that's fine. I think the problem is when we have crossed the line, when our sexual behaviors become problematic, as it has for sex addicts and porn addicts, that just opens the door to all kinds of self-delusion, because I think we can just get in a whole bunch of trouble with that. So I would really encourage people to not pursue that, at least right off the bat. Again, I don't want to be too moralistic here, but boy, just a lot of experience dealing with a lot of different people, and when they can have an experience with another human being that is multidimensional, meaning not just physical sex, but other layers of things as well, right? Other emotions, other even spiritual beliefs can amplify that, and physical touch beyond just performative sex, but things like just touch is tremendously important. So I guess long story short, yeah, those things are out there. I think can we do it without the emotional connection? Yeah, men probably easier than women, but I think that's kind of a rabbit hole that we can fall down into. And it's probably not a great discussion for a sex addict to have, because we're trying to figure out how to control our behavior, not what other options we have for it.
Yeah, thank you. That was the last of our questions from last week.
Man.
So I told you we had a bunch of them. So let's jump into this week's question. Me and my porn addict are separated at the moment. I've lost almost all hope of him ever changing. He's been in recovery, and air quotes, for almost 4 years. He's going to support groups, therapy, and work groups about his trauma, yet he has not been able to be sober in all this time. Why is that? He says he's in recovery even if he's not sober, but I don't understand how someone can do all this work and still keep acting out. I'm so confused. I'm going to make another work group plug here. You said he's in work groups for his trauma. He needs to get in a work group for his porn addiction, which I'm going to put a link to that in the chat feature. Now I will let David address all the rest of that stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sorry you find yourself in this position. That's a painful one after all that time and effort. 4 years is a long time. I think sometimes we have our therapeutic priorities maybe out of whack, meaning, I'm a trauma therapist. Trauma is an incredibly important part of recovery and healing. I think trauma leads to a lot of addictive behavior. But I also know that I can't do serious trauma work with somebody until they really have some foundations of recovery under their belt. And so there's a sequence thing here that we have to pay attention to. As I mentioned earlier tonight, our addictions are our primary coping mechanisms. We take those away, people get clean and sober. Their skill set is pretty thin to deal with life. And so the skills are we have to go through, whether that's compassion and empathy, or staying sober, or dealing with feelings, or regulating my emotions, or there's all kinds of stuff that we look at early on. And that provides a foundation to start doing some of the deeper work that is also essential, but that's like phase 2. And I'm wondering if maybe your husband has been working on kind of the wrong stuff out of sequence. And I've seen, and this is sometimes with the collusion of therapists, I've seen therapists actually cause relapses because they want to do trauma therapy, and it's interesting and it's rewarding and blah, 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 but they're doing it too soon. So I totally agree with Scott. I think to simplify, put the trauma stuff on the shelf, let's get down to basics. And yeah, we can check the boxes, right? We can go to support groups, we can go to therapy, I can't tell you how many of our clients have come and, if not, I don't know what percentage, but it's a high percentage. Will say basically, yeah, I've gone to therapy for years. I never was honest. I never told the truth once, and so people lie and manipulate and minimize and rationalize and tell themselves, I'm doing everything right. I don't know why it's not working. But they're not being really totally honest with themselves. So I think, yeah, that's what I think. I think he needs to really look at basics of addiction and what's underneath there. There's some block, some issues, and I think honestly, I think probably a residential treatment program would, like seeking care, to be a really good thing, because we get a lot of guys like this that come in and they don't understand what's wrong, and we can, with some poking and prodding and encouraging and hand-holding, we can usually figure out what those barriers are. And there is a barrier there, and it may be fear on his part, or it could be like, who am I if I give up my addiction? It can be anything, but I think there's something not quite right there. And I think I get the sense that he's kind of spinning his wheels, checking off the boxes, going through the motions, but it's not working. And so I think I would then change the strategy and do something else. And as we said before, if it's not working, then one of the things that makes sense to do is increase the intensity of that strategy. So maybe he needs to go into a residential program for a couple of weeks, or intensive outpatient, or something different.
Yeah. But don't do trauma work until you're solidly sober and have a support network, and because it's going to take you out of your window of tolerance, and of course you're going to relapse. It's just a given. It's like almost expected. Gotta do this, get sober first. So yeah, and after 4 years, David's right, maybe it's time to consider the highest level of care that's out there, which is kind of treatment.
If I may, Scott, because we talked about this in the last couple of questions about recovery versus sobriety and all that. We're going dance around the edges of that before, and that shows up again in this question. How can someone be in recovery and not sober? We've talked about both people we've seen in our respective fellowships, and I'm thinking of somebody I used to see in AA a lot, who's, when I was new, he had 20 years of clean time, but he'd never really worked the program. He was the angriest person I think I've ever met on earth, and just sour and nasty and mean and sarcastic. But he didn't have a drink. But boy, there's so much more that he wasn't doing, right? And so I think we have to take the whole spectrum of recovery activities into account.
Yeah, and then the opposite. Like I feel like I was in recovery for 2 years, but not doing very well with my sobriety. But I was changing my behavior, and then eventually it clicked in, and I got some sobriety. But it was 2 years of slippy for me. But I was learning. I was going to meetings. I was paying attention. I was participating. I was being honest. Well, the second half of that, I started being honest, and that's when actually, like, the fourth quarter of that, I started being honest, and then I got sober miraculously. Once I started being honest, I think there's a correlation.
Could be.
So, how long for a partner to heal from betrayal trauma? You said 3 to 5 years. We talked about this earlier. Does this period get reset each time there is another new discovery? I got hit with my second D-Day 2 months ago, and I'm really struggling so much to keep my head above water this time, more than my first discovery 2.5 years ago, which is not uncommon. But David, thoughts?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm sorry, because there's nothing more painful than thinking, well, at least it's all out, and then there's more, right, out of left field, or the sort of dripping disclosure of like a little bit here, a little bit there, not quite the whole story, and then more leaks out, and it's a very incredibly painful way to do it. Again, these time things are kind of arbitrary and long, but I think you have to assume that if there's these major discoveries, especially like 2.5 years apart, that's going to slow down the process, if not bring it to a screeching halt. And so, yeah, that time frame for recovery is really with both people doing their work, and getting their respective support, and learning how to communicate feelings and set boundaries, and communicate effectively with each other, act as a team. We talk about going from a me to a we and all that. But if there's what does the discovery do? As you said, the second time has been worse than the first. It brings up that trauma. Now you're on edge, and when we're hypervigilant and guarded against those feelings, we lose that kind of heart space we need to be able to be in at least some of the time to heal, and because we shut that off, it's too vulnerable and raw. And so, yeah, does it shut down that process? Absolutely. And again, with couples, when we talk about that, textbook 3 to 5 year window, do slips happen? Yeah, they probably do, even a relapse or two. Hopefully not, but it could happen. It's not going to throw the whole thing into the ditch, but something as major as a discovery means there was dishonesty kind of all along. And, so the healing hadn't really started. The clock hadn't started yet from that point of view, at least on the addict's part. So, yeah, I mean, the sad answer to your question is, yeah, it's going to slow that down.
Yeah, it's going to slow it down a lot, probably. There's research out there that shows that betrayed partners of sex addicts experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They may or may not actually have post-traumatic stress disorder. It has to stick around for a certain amount of time. All this, the study didn't delve that deeply, but they had symptoms, all of the nightmares and the avoidance and the anxiety and all of this post-traumatic stress.
Hypervigilance,
Sherlocking, all of that. And then there's something called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is not an official diagnosis, but it's on its way to becoming one. And it's when the trauma keeps repeating, because it just adds layers and layers to it. Being re-traumatized when you're working to trust somebody, being re-betrayed, that's a living hell. And I really feel your pain. Yeah, David, do you want to talk a little about post-traumatic stress disorder, or?
Yeah, so we know that when there's trauma, and trauma is defined as really kind of having an experience that pushes our ability to cope with something beyond our capabilities, right? And there's also, for one of the criteria of PTSD and trauma is that we have to feel as if it's almost like a life or death situation. And that's the one in the academic worlds where is this a situation with betrayed partners or not? But I think the emotions that go with that sense of powerlessness and like life is ending, the rug pulled out from under us, the world I knew is gone. I mean, in that sense, all those senses, that there is this kind of life and death feel about it. But the fact, and that technicality aside, the betrayed partners meet the criteria in many cases for PTSD, post-traumatic stress, and there's the kind of things we talked about, the intrusive dreams or thoughts, the hypervigilance, the kind of being on edge all the time, the sense of hopelessness, the dismay, all that goes with this. And unfortunately, this is not that unusual with sex addiction or any addiction really, with the kind of frequency of relapse. You lay the groundwork for what Scott just described with complex PTSD. We have a complex grief, similar kind of thing where we don't have a chance to heal from the first thing, and then the second thing follows, and then the third, and it just kind of layers to the point where people get kind of frozen and hopeless and really stuck. And by the way, you combine this, and I think there's some research that's pointing to this too, where people actually betrayed partners do develop PTSD, is when they've had the abandonment, the betrayal, the abuse already, right? So they're carrying a lot of stuff from their own past, and then all that gets reawakened in their marriage now. And so it's a whole big ball of, that really is hard to wade through. So now the good news is that there's really, really good treatments for PTSD and trauma, more so all the time. Where the last 15 years has been this amazing period of understanding how trauma works and what we can do about it. And so things like EMDR, hypnotherapy, or brain spotting, or somatic experiencing, there's a whole bunch of them. The key to any good trauma therapy is that it has to have both a component of cognitive stuff, so like talk therapy, talking about stuff, but we know that talk therapy is not enough for trauma, because trauma has a physical component. Trauma embeds itself in our body's nervous system, and that has to be released as well. So there's some what we call somatic component that it may involve breath, it may involve other kinds of release or awarenesses about body patterns, but it has to have both those things. But there's some amazing trauma work out there. And by the way, like EMDR, I do EMDR myself. You don't have to recount. If you're going into a trauma space, you don't have to narrate what's happening. The brain is the client themselves, and their brain is doing the healing. The therapist just kind of guides them, but you don't have to narrate, because a lot of people are saying, I don't want to talk about it and live through it again. I don't have to tell another person about it. You don't. You have to be guided into it, and you have to be feeling yourself. But there's pretty powerful techniques. So don't be horrified or shy or afraid of trauma. I mean, it does happen. It's not a lightweight thing, but there's really good interventions out there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, betrayal trauma is called betrayal trauma for a reason, and that's what this is. And I just want to read the last bit of this question again. I'm really struggling so much to keep my head above water, this time more than my first discovery 2.5 years ago. I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about, and I'm glad we got into it so we can not necessarily normalize this for you, but at least validate it and say, yeah, yeah, this is why. And yeah, so we have some questions left. I'm going to save them for next week because we're out of time. Not nearly as many leftover questions this time as last week. But I'm going to save them. I promise we'll get to them first thing next week. Thank you, everybody, for great questions.
Beautiful questions.
Yeah, great stuff. David, anything you want to say to take us out?
No, except just I'm so impressed with how thoughtful people are and really seriously looking for solutions. It's great.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We'll see you next Wednesday. Have a good rest of the week.
Thanks, Scott. Take care now.